This is a concept that I've been pondering for a long time now. There's such a breadth of Mgtow content available on YouTube today, staggering, deep, insightful content across an array of topics, from Fashirian runaway to house husbands, mechanisation, birth control, and even transhumanist concepts like the socio-political implications of an artificial womb. Being Mgtow and understanding what we do about the world, particularly the world of gender relations and evolutionary psychology, we get the sense that all of these concepts are somehow vaguely related, though perhaps in a way not yet entirely understood to us. An outside observer to the Mgtow community may even view these video topics independently of each other and see them as completely disassociated concepts. You see, what the great minds of Mgtow have been creating over the last few years is something unconscious and emergent, each person independently formalising their observations into workable theories to explain some small part of the human condition: dominance hierarchy, male-mother need, in-group bias. What these Mgtow were all independently working towards, perhaps completely unaware of how it directly related to the works of other Mgtow around them, is essentially a unified theory of the human condition. Most of the intellectual building blocks like Briefo's law and male-mother need have existed for a while now. I think it's time that we actually try to start fitting these disassociated pieces of knowledge together to create a completely unified theory of Mgtow, a better, more complete way to understand ourselves, as well as providing a more complete foundation on which we can build these more abstract concepts the leading Mgtow thinkers are currently heading towards today. At first, I didn't really know where to start. Exactly how does one go about trying to unify the theory of male disposability with the kind of female hypoagency we've seen play out in the atheist community and now the gaming community? Obviously, these concepts are somehow related to each other in that they deal with the fundamental tug-of-war between the gendered needs of individuals versus the gendered needs of the species. But how do they really fit into the big picture relative to each other? Eventually, it occurred to me that rather than trying to fit these concepts together, I had to start from the very foundation and ask, what is the actual basis of human behaviour? Well, most basically, we need food, we need shelter. Once those basic individual survival needs are secured, we can start to branch out and form groups to help each other with food and shelter. If we keep working in this fashion, we effectively end up with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a fairly simple concept, but very effective at showing what things people need and in what order. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. As an intellectual foundation to build on, once we understand our basic needs, we can begin to map on the psychological strategies we employ to fulfill those needs. With the exception of statistical outliers like clinical psychopaths, the needs of all humans are pretty much the same. But from almost the very base of the pyramid, we see strong differences in the methods and strategies employed by men and women to fulfill those needs. For instance, everyone needs resources, but where men undertake the risky job of manually acquiring or creating these resources, often resulting in disposability on their part, women, some of whom are even successful in their own right, will almost universally marry up to increase their resource or property portfolio. We call this hypergamy. Almost all of the basic Mgtow concepts that we've discussed and refined over the last half-decade somehow strategically relate to the fulfillment of needs within that hierarchy. Family gives us male-mother need and Briefo's law. Friends give us automatic in-group bias. Achievement relates to the fact that we see men as human doings rather than human beings. For women, their sense of achievement comes largely from hypoagency, pushing their way into already established male communities they didn't create and often actually mocked or derided the development of, as in the case of, gaming and comic culture. Self-esteem and respect, we see men competing in dominance hierarchies, and women, both traditional and feminist, essentially invoking the golden uterus. Now that we have some of those basics bedded down, we can start to see people's needs and how they fulfill those needs. To quote Barbarossa from his video response to Stone, culture is a function of biology, and the differences in culture that we see arise from a fixed human nature adapting to a variable environment. This is that fixed human nature. To the degree that we can assign purpose in this uncaring universe, the purpose of living organisms is to survive and reproduce. What you're essentially looking at here is the fundamental building blocks of how that psychological process manifests in an individual human ape. The human ape's needs in hierarchical order, as well as the biologically instinctual strategies for fulfilling those needs. Hopefully you've already worked this out, but these needs and strategies are biologically fixed and apply universally to all people across all cultures. In that same video, Barbarossa cited a social study that examined the handing over of Hong Kong back to China in 1998. Now, within both of those cultures, men acquired resources and women married those men. When the borders broke down and beautiful Chinese women suddenly had access to wealthy, high-profile Hong Kong men with more resources than the local Chinese men they'd previously had access to, there was a huge influx of women from China marrying Hong Kong men, and the remaining Hong Kong women being forced to expatriate themselves in hopes of finding a suitable mate, rather than marrying down to one of the less wealthy Chinese men now available to them. This wasn't some bizarre black swan event. Biological needs and instinctual psychological strategies of these men and women didn't suddenly change overnight. The environment changed, and we observed the exact same predictable psychological strategies they'd always had being exaggerated. Now, I'm sure you were all wondering where I was going with this, and it's not by accident that I've left it until last. Self-actualization manifests fundamentally differently in men and women. Primarily that having evolved over millions of years towards a more gynocentric reproductive strategy, for men to truly self-actualize, they need to break most of their fundamental biological drives. This is somewhat analogous to the debate that's been going on in recent times regarding the definition of Mgtow, specifically whether married men can reasonably identify as being Mgtow. Personally, I find the debate ridiculous on its face. You can exercise a degree of independence in a relationship. You could even be like-minded enough that you largely want the same things as a couple. And I suppose you could call yourself a couple going your way together, if you wanted. But if your life is that socially and legally intertwined with another person, I don't think you can reasonably call yourself a man going his own way. I think the same reasoning applies to the peak of Maslow's pyramid. The man may be able to pursue at least some of his interests, but as long as those interests are only enjoyed within the framework of his man cave, some dark corner of the house that he's allowed to play in when his wife says he's finished with his chores, I'm not sure I could reasonably label that situation self-actualizing. I think the fork road icon of Mgtow is rather apt here. To self-actualize as a man and reach a true state of male entropy, you basically have to reject and bypass all the instinctual processes for the fulfillment of those hierarchical needs. I mean, rising through the instinctual process, the best a man can possibly hope to achieve is the traditionalist or feminist status quo. You know, he can show off his wife, his 2.3 kids, a dog, a white picket fence, all of which require him to work a 50-hour week to support and put the female in charge of himself and his family. A man cannot truly self-actualize if his path was built on a desperate male mother need to get some woman to like him. Hopefully that should also highlight the stupid, contradictory nature of pickup artist culture, as well as their attempted rebranding of neo-masculinity. That's not self-actualizing. Male mother need and almost every other strategy on the male side of the diagram is ultimately about actualizing the needs of women rather than actualizing his own needs. True self-actualization is basically about freedom. It's entropy, it's freedom to create and explore. It's about always moving forward at an exponential rate. As Stardust would probably put it, It's about reaching escape velocity. Self-actualization in women is very, very different from men. Where men are outward-looking, women tend to look inwards. Their self-actualization is much more bidirectional and linear. Now, at first glance, it looks as though it's the same as what's happening on the male side of the psychological divide. And you may be asking, why is this process self-actualization for women but not men? The answer is simple. Gynocentrism, in both its major forms, actualizes the needs of women. When men engage in feminism or traditionalism, they're necessarily actualizing the needs of women. When women engage in feminism or traditionalism, they're necessarily actualizing for themselves, i.e. self-actualization. Their personal female values and experiences rather than objective facts tend to form their intellectual worldview. We hear it from feminists all the time that the opinions of men don't count because we can't possibly comprehend the lived experiences of women. It's rather telling that when mapped against the hierarchy of needs, the last psychological step for women before self-actualization is the golden uterus. Whether left-wing feminist or right-wing traditionalist, the act of simply being a woman and their place on the reproductive pedestal is what largely informs their worldview. Feminists expect manginas to grant them special treatment as victims, and tradcons expect gentlemen to grant them special treatment as ladies. But they're basically two sides of the same coin. And in turn, their intellectual worldview, whether that is feminism or traditionalism, tends to flow back down the hierarchy to rationalise and reinforce their personal experiences and choices. Female self-actualization is very circular and recursive. This is what our old friend Burn the Ender would probably call the rationalization hamster. And this inward recursive process is probably why we see the different tangible outcomes that we do. One is about understanding and solving external problems. The other is about internal problems. Self-actualization for men has given us calculus, the internal combustion engine, the power of flight, the microprocessor. The self-actualization of women has given us VAWA, patriarchy theory, tender years doctrine, and Emily's List. I think this model gives us a much better foundation for understanding what makes the human ape tick, as well as a better foundational grounding for future Mgtow exploration. It also gives us a much better overview of strategies that will and won't work towards our ultimate end goal of male sovereignty. In other words, hopefully it will help us be more efficient and pick our battles better. For instance, when gamers actually started to push back against the invasion into their community, they were instantly labelled creepy, neck-bearded white misogynerds still living in their parents' basement who can't get laid. This is because, despite there being a plethora of objective, verifiable evidence that people like Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn have committed unethical acts up to and including actual monetary fraud, there is a biological, automatic in-group preference for them because they're women. Gamergate supporters were essentially playing against a biologically stacked deck. Some things have to be addressed in a certain order, otherwise it's like trying to change the tyre on a car before the vehicle has come to a complete stop. That problem of in-group preference speaks to a lower need in the hierarchy and will need to be overcome first before any real progress can be made regarding invasive hypoagency. Taking that to its logical conclusion, this diagram should also show how ridiculous the Dean Esmays and Bernard Chapins of the world are, with their defeat feminism, defeat the left nonsense. These political ideologies, left or right, are the very end result of this need hierarchy. I think at best, the gynocentric actualization at the apex of the pyramid would just be relabeled something else, but still fundamentally operate in the same way, because ultimately it's built on the same fundamental biological needs and ingrained psychological instincts of the human ape. And again, we're already starting to see the data reflect that with the rise of groups like Women Against Feminism, who explicitly state they're not MRA friendly. Anyways, that's a brief overview of my proposal to start trying to fit the basic Mgtow concepts into a unified theory of the human condition.